Next up is Rob Preston. Rob received a BA in Biological Sciences and Chemistry and an MA in Botany from CSU Chico, probably right here in this room, right? And a PhD in Botany from UC Davis. He's retired following a career as a consulting botanist with ICF in Sacramento and currently serves as a research associate at the UC Davis Center for Plant Diversity. Rob is currently working on several papers describing new plant taxa and is a contributing author and editor for the Jepson Manual and eFlora. The main focus of his research has included Streptanthus, Rhodea, and Dipterostemon, but starting to include other genera. Rob has been working for over 30 years to understand the taxonomy of annual Atriplex species in California's Great Valley, and today he'll present the newly described Atriplex gypsophila and summarize the annual Atriplex species of the Great Valley. Please welcome Rob.
Thanks, Len. It's great to be back here in person in Chico after missing the last few years, and it's also great to see a crowded room. That's speakers. I love that. My talk today really has two goals. The first is, in keeping with the theme of this session, is to introduce the new species that I've described, Atriplex gypsophila. And the second goal is that, this is a really short story, so my second goal is to provide a little context to better appreciate this story. There's a bunch of these little annual Atriplex species scattered up and down the Great Valley and adjacent to the Great Valley, but they're not well known. One reason is that, well, they're not very big, they're not very showy, and they're certainly not charismatic. And another reason is, I don't know who said it first, but to study the summertime flora of the Central Valley, you have to be a little bit crazy. So I was fortunate in my career as a consulting botanist that I actually got paid to go out and botanize in areas where these species occurred. And I grew up in Redding, so I don't mind a little bit of summer heat. So I want to start out with an overview of the taxonomy of these species to provide a little context. Atriplex is a diverse genus. In California, there's 32 native species. There's 32 native species with about 43 terminal taxa. Today I'm focusing on a small group of annuals that mostly occur in and adjacent to the San Joaquin Valley. These species are sometimes grouped within the subsection Pusili, and that's of which the type species is Atriplex pusilla, which is actually a Great Basin species that just barely makes it into a couple places in California. The plants are small, generally less than 20 centimeters tall. They have prostrate to spreading branches, and they have small clasping leaves. So, and that habit is pretty similar among all of the species. The taxonomy of these species has been in flux over the last 30 years. In the first and second editions of the Jepson Manual, the treatments were pretty similar, with the addition of 3 other taxa in the second edition. Stan Welsh, who did the Flora North America treatment, had a little different approach, and he lumped 5 of the more diminutive species, all within as varieties of Atriplex gypsophila. Atriplex gypsophila is actually a Southern California species that actually occurs primarily in Riverside County. And getting into the game late, Jillian Chu and Stuart Sanderson in the world's monograph of the family Chenopodiaceae, they put them all in the genus Obayoni. Obayoni is a large genus that encompasses all of the C4 species. And actually, there's several different lineages that led to the C4 plants. And so the Obione is paraphyletic, and that doesn't apply to our species. So the group of, oops, wrong button, there we go. The group of the more diminutive species, Atriplex gypsophila, minuscula, subtilis, and persistens, are all diploids, and these plants are all very minute, very diminutive. Atriplex cordulata and coronata, in contrast, they're tetraploids, and they're a little bit more robust and a little more erect. And in keeping with that pattern, the largest species, Atriplex erecticalis, is actually a hexaploid. Historically, these species occurred on valley floors in highly alkaline soils, primarily on the margins of, well, what used to be Tulare Lake, Kern Lake, and Buena Vista Lakes. They also occur on valley floors in some of the adjacent valleys on the Coast Range side, on the Carrizo Plain, in the Shalom Valley, Livermore Valley. And they also occur where Coast Range streams kind of dead-ended down on the valley floor, like you see in some of the basins, like the Calusa Basin and the Yolo Basin. The habitats include Allen Rolfia, iodine bush scrub, salt bush scrub, and other open herbaceous habitats where the plants occur on the, mostly on the margins. Right button. Mostly on the margins of alkali vernal pools, sometimes in the basins, also in slick spots and alkaline rain pools. Here's what most of that habitat looks like now, unfortunately. There are still little remnants of the habitat scattered up and down the valley and in adjacent areas. This is a private parcel west of Madeira, and you can see the alkali habitats shows up in bright patches against the dark background of the annual grasslands. But most of the habitat for these species occurs in the state and national wildlife refuges. This is in Kern County, the Kern National Wildlife Refuge occurs here. And to the south is the state's semi-tropic ecological reserve. And there's some private lands along the west side that used to be duck clubs, but they've been bought up and are now proposed conservation lands. My story really revolves around one of the species, Atriplex vallicola. Vallicola, I got to get my pronunciation right. As Bill Durr used to say in botany here, you got to get your accent on the right syllable. This is a diminutive species that only occurs in a couple of places in the San Joaquin Valley and adjacent to it. It was described by Bob Hoover in 1938. And Bob Hoover was one of Willis Jepson's last grad student, and he based the species on collections that he made near Lost Hills down in Kern County. He later became professor of botany at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo and did the first flora of San Luis Obispo County. And even though he described it, he wasn't quite sure what to do with it. At first, he compared it, he characterized it as a smaller version of Atriplex cordulata. But later on, he kind of shifted and decided it was closer to Atriplex coronata. And furthermore, he even stated that there was another species that occurred on the Carrizo Plain that he thought might be another species because it exactly matched the type of Atriplex vallicola. So his concept of this species changed over time, and it kind of included more than one taxa. So It was added, Atriplex vallicola was added to the CNPS inventory in 1974, which made it a focus of rare plant surveys in and around the San Joaquin Valley. The problem was that nobody really knew what it was, myself included. And in 2001, I was doing surveys for a power line, a proposed power line to the west of I-5 between Santa Nella and Coalinga. So this is a really nice area that includes the Sierra Hills and the Monocline Ridge area. And I came across these patches of a small Atriplex, keyed right out to Atriplex vallicola. So we mapped the stands. I took voucher specimens, submitted all my CNDDB forms, and didn't think too much more about it. Fast forward 16 years, and I was doing surveys in Kern County and on some of those private conservation lands, and there was really nice alkaline habitat there with lots of Atriplex coronata scattered all around it. But there was these small patches of a more diminutive species. And once again, they keyed out to Atriplex vallicola. And when I compared those to Hoover's type specimen of Atriplex vallicola, they matched. So I was pretty sure that that's what I had. And later I went to the type locality for Atriplex vallicola, and I found it. It was still there after all this time. And that's when the light went on in my brain, and I said, those plants that I collected up on Sierra Hills, they weren't this. They weren't Atriplex vallicola at all. They were something different. So the next step that I had to take was to compare Atriplex. I went back and looked at my specimens that I'd collected, and re-examined them and compared them to Atriplex vallicola and all of the other Atriplex species, and they were distinct. They had different fruit shapes, they were different size, and I described them as Atriplex gypsophila. In habit, it's very similar to all the other. It's got the same basic ground plan, and it's probably most similar morphologically to Atriplex coronata. But it differs in size. It's diminutive. It's about half the size of coronata. And it differs in the fruit morphology. Atriplex coronata has these kind of broader than long fruits, in contrast to Atriplex vallicola, which has these wedge-shaped fruits, and Atriplex gypsophila, which has these fan-shaped fruits with a kind of more or less distinct pseudostype at the base. So they differ morphologically, but more importantly, they differ in terms of the habitat. Atriplex coronata and all of these other annual Atriplexes occur down in the valley floors on highly alkaline habitats, often in association with other halophytes like Allenrolfia and Frankenia, Cressa, Disticlus. Atriplex gypsophila occurs on badlands, on these barrens, on these hilltops, on these hill slopes. And the soils are derived from marine sediments. They're very interesting soils. They've got a lot of fossils in them, like shark's teeth, fossil seashells, and there's chunks of gypsum crystals that are embedded in the soil, which is where I got the epithet gypsophila. The vegetation is sparse, and there are Atriplex polycarpus shrubs, but most of the habitat is really bare. But in the springtime, you get these great displays of wildflowers, lots of monolopia, phacelia, just tons of these little, there's like a dozen different annual Eriogonum species. And there's lots of rare species associated with it. Lepidium jarrettii, Dynandria holliana, Media radiata, Amsynchia fricata, and about a half dozen rare annual Eriogonum species like Eriogonum gossypinum. So if you talk to Ryan Odell, who's the BLM botanist for this area, he'll attest that this is just a spectacular habitat, and it's really worth going and botanizing it. Unfortunately, a lot of it is BLM lands. The access is kind of wonky because there's a lot of private lands there, but if you ever have a chance to get down in this area and explore it, and go for it. So in a similar vein, And backing up just a step, that second species that Hoover mentioned as being exactly the same as the type specimen of Atriplex vallicola, it also turned out to be a new species. And it was described by Chu and Sanderson as Atriplex flavida. So this occurs in the Carrizo Plains and is very similar morphologically to Atriplex follicula. It's diminutive, it has these small leaves, but it has this striking golden color, very characteristic, and it's imparted by these yellowish trichomes that are on the leaves and stems. So in conclusion, I've got several take-home messages. The first is always take good field notes and collect voucher specimens, because you never know, down the road, 15, 20 years, they might come in really handy. And second, there's a general unfamiliarity with these little annual Atriplex species, which has led to a tendency to lump the taxa. This has led to a number of adverse consequences beyond just simple misidentifications. For example, the chromosome count for Atriplex vallicola is based on specimens from the Carrizo Plains, which means that those counts are actually for Atriplex flavida. And it's also resulted in an overestimate of the number of occurrences of Atriplex vallicola, so that species appears to be more common than it actually is. And moreover, I believe that Atriplex vallicola still contains a couple of, well, for more careful study, we've seen that the Atriplex vallicola really was, there were two undescribed species lumped in with that taxa that have now been described. And I believe that there's probably a couple more that remain to be described. So they're still under study. So with that, I'll close and ask if there's any questions.
Hi, Rob. There's a lot of young people in the audience, and being in the field with you, this is Michelle Stevens, has been one of the great treats of my life. And I wondered if you'd ever thought of doing a workshop on field notebooks, because yours are the most beautiful I've ever seen. Your botanic illustrations are outstanding. You talked about being careful of field notebooks, and people don't talk about that anymore. And I think it'd be really neat for you to do a workshop for all of us on how to do really good, beautiful works of art field notebooks.
Well, thanks, Michelle. I haven't thought about it because they're still kind of personal, but it would be something that would be fun to do. I'm not a great organizer, but I don't know. I could be talked into it.
Sounds like a workshop.
These species obviously occur in what is now agriculture. Are you seeing these species on the interface between agriculture and these wildlands, or is it purely in the wildlands areas?
No, sure, they'll show up. They can be a little bit weedy sometimes, but generally in an area, if it's been cultivated, it's changed the soil chemistry. The soil texture has changed a lot about the habitat, and so. You don't see, you might find remnants, but the habitat itself is pretty screwed up. Is that it? Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Rob.